Good evening, everyone. Kalisperasas. Let me first say that our thoughts are with those fighting the horrific fires in Greece, and we hope that the situation returns to normal as soon as possible. Allow me to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and we pay our respects to the elders past, present and emerging. I extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. Also, a special welcome to our guests and participants tonight. Firstly, Professor Nicholas Doumanis, who is the co-author of the evening's book, and also to launch the book and provide commentary, we have with us Dr Andonis Piperoglou, the inaugural Hellenic Senior Lecturer in Global Diasporas at the University of Melbourne, who has just clocked up a year into the job. Congratulations, Antonis. This is a very busy week for the Greek community of Melbourne. Antonis is delivering on this Thursday as part of the normal seminar series, his seminar on Launching Little Greece, Transcultural Place Naming and Narratives of Migration. Furthermore, as part of the La Trobe Uni's Daedalus Hellenic Archives Research Seminar Series, which is supported by the Greek community of Melbourne, this Wednesday at the mezzanine, 7 p.m. usual time, we have the ACU's Professor Joy Demusi, who'll be speaking on sport and the community. If this wasn't enough, Antonis is playing live at the Greek this Friday, a tribute to the Greek singer Michalis Menidiatis. And I believe also on Saturday afternoon, the GACL has got the anti-podium palette, if I'm correct, as well. So it's almost an activity every day of the week. So if you're not a member of the community, I encourage you all to join the community, subscribe and attend its events. It's a one-stop shop. You don't need to organise your social life, we do it for you. Okay. Why this book launch, many of you might ask? Isn't it just another history book on Greece? They're a dime a dozen. And why invite and celebrate a Sydney-sider? Generally, aren't most Sydney-siders stuck up, uptight, and generally rude, emotionless people lacking culture? Let me answer these questions one by one. Surprise, this invitee hasn't left yet, but anyway. No, it's just not another book launch. This book is a collaborative effort co-authored by two exceptional individuals, two excellent academics, and two outstanding intellectuals. Athens-based Emeritus Professor Antonis Liakos and Sydney-raised Professor Nicholas Doumanis. Yes, we Greeks might suffer from too much history. I'll be the first to admit to that. But this is not the run-of-the-mill book on Greek history. Its focus is beyond what we today call territorial or metropolitan Greece. Its focus is on Greek people, which also extends to those living in Cyprus and those in the diaspora. Its focus is also on the modern era, the 20th and the early 21st century. It was both a tumultuous and transformative period where Greece lurched from crisis to crisis, and in the process became more urbanised, more secularised and westernised. It focuses on the interplay between states and society, but also how Greeks engaged with global change and the impact of international factors in their lives. We're also here to celebrate, to acknowledge, to salute and to farewell award-winning historian Nicholas Doumanis, who's been teaching history at the University of New South Wales since 2001. Just recently he was appointed to the Hellenic Foundation Chair of Hellenic Studies and a Professor of History at the University of Illinois in Chicago. He flies out next week to take up this role. So he's a Sydney-sider who's an exception to the rule, who's presented at the seminar series on numerous occasions in the past and has been instrumental in setting up the Greek Australian Archive under the auspices of the State Library of New South Wales, and who will be putting Greek Australia academia on the map with his new appointment. So Nick, it's an absolute honour to have you in Melbourne this evening, and don't take to heart my initial comments about Sydney-siders. This project, this book, this initiative has been in the works for about half a decade. It's been a collaborative effort with Professor Antonis Liakos from Athens. A few words on Professor Liakos. He's an Emeritus Professor of Contemporary History and the History of Historiography at the University of Athens. He was born in Athens. He was imprisoned by the military junta in 1969 while a student of history at the Aristotelian University of Thessaloniki, and then was released in 1973. He completed his PhD at the same university and taught there until 1990 before taking a position of professor at the Department of History and Archaeology at the University of Athens. He's been a research fellow and visiting professor at the University of Birmingham, the European University Institute, the University of Sydney, University of Princeton, and École Normale Supérieure in Paris. Unfortunately, Professor Liakos can't be with us here tonight, but he's emailed me a statement in Greek. Well, I'll read out I translated the English version. Greetings from afar, from Greece, which is being tested by extreme heat and fires, in a word, climate change. We wrote this book with Nikos Doumanis, having in mind readers who do not reside in Athens and not only interested in the political developments happening there. We wrote it for people like you in mind, attending the book's first launch in Melbourne, but also fellow historians and friends of history who might be in Asia, in Latin America, and many other parts of the globe. Our initial question, before putting pen to paper, was why all these people are interested or should be interested in the history of Greece, especially in the recent past and in this century. The book we had to write belonged to a series under the auspices of Edinburgh University Press called The History of the Greeks. It's a multi-volume collection. Therefore, what does the history of the Greeks in the 20th and 21st century include? Of course, it includes Greek society, but it also includes Cyprus, which developed into an independent state entity, and above all, it includes Greeks, or those who identify as Greeks, all over the world, what we often call the Greek diaspora. Until the First World War, this reality was quite clear. Most Greeks lived outside the Greek state. In the 20th century, through successive and painful convulsions, old populations gathered in Greece and other populations created new communities around the world. This transition is described in this book, and I think it's the first time that the history of Greece has been portrayed in such a manner, using such an approach. Therefore, the objective in our writing approach was to have the society, the economy, the demographic developments, the political decisions that determine the fate of millions, and how all these were transformed through global and dramatic developments of the 20th and 21st century. That's the approach. Did we achieve our objective? You, the reader, will tell us. You'll be the judge. However, Nikos Doumanis and I collaborated for 5 years, and we enjoyed it as we faced and discussed historical problems, what to include and what to omit, how to interpret this or how to interpret that. A journey that was more than worth it. Thank you, Antonis Liakos. So, a few words from Antonis there. And now a few words about the man of the moment, Sydney-born Nick Doumanis, who's a historian of Europe and the Mediterranean world. His undergraduate studies in history were at the University of Sydney. This was followed by a PhD at UNSW. He was awarded the Franklin Prize in Contemporary European History for the book Myth and Memory in the Mediterranean, which is derived from his PhD thesis looking at the influence of Italian occupation in the Dodecanese. Nick's family also hails from the Dodecanese island of Kos. Other academic monographs from Nick include Italy, Inventing the Nation, A History of Greece in the Palgrave Macmillan's Essential History series, and Before the Nation, Muslim-Christian Coexistence and Its Destruction in Late Ottoman Anatolia. That was by Oxford University Press in 2013. He's currently editing the Oxford Handbook of Europe, 1914 to 1945, and writing a history of the Eastern Mediterranean from the Bronze Age to the present for Wiley Blackwell in its History of the World series. Let's get the show on the road, and I invite our very own Dr. Andonis Piperoglou to the podium to launch the book. Big round of applause for Nick and Antonis.
Thanks, Nick. I too, as someone whose mother was born in Cyprus, you've probably heard me say this before, but worth repeating. You know, my mother was born in Cyprus, and I've inherited pretty healthy distrust of colonial regimes, and because of this, that I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and to acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded on these lands, these peculiar lands. It's often raining from the bay and on to the mountains that surround us beyond. Welcome. Kalos ήρθατε. Good to be with you. I first became aware of the Edinburgh History of Greeks, published by Edinburgh University Press, when I just finished my doctoral studies. My thesis was examined by the series editor, Professor Thomas Gallant, he's based in California, a kind of stalwart in histories of the Greek world written in the English language. And Tom wrote a volume that I have with me here called the Edinburgh History of Greeks, 1768 to 1913, the long 19th century, which is a pretty fascinating period of Greek history, largely because it coincides with the kind of emergence and continued kind of growth of the modern Greek nation state. So aware of kind of Tom's clever ability to synthesize this kind of dense period for a wide audience, I've since been awaiting the publication, as we've just heard, that's been in the works for about 5 years, of the Edinburgh's history of Greeks 20th and early 21st centuries. And it's a subtitle that makes this book distinctive, Global Perspectives. So as the volume reveals, it's centered on a period of history that I, and I'm sure many of you, are most familiar. Greeks during the World Wars, the trauma of the catastrophe, the Nazi invasion, the accompanying stories of resistance, the problems that kind of come out of the civil conflict that followed, eventual integration into the European Union, and the more recent crisis years. These are high points, or perhaps low points, moments in the Greek world, the world over, that I'm sure you're familiar with. So it's due to a coverage that is most closely tied to the present that I, and I'm sure many of you, I was keen to get my hands on it, to sort of understand this more immediate past. I was also keen to kind of peer into its pages as I think it's the most up-to-date volume, as this most up-to-date volume was co-authored by my other thesis examiner, who's here tonight, Nick Doumanis, who, yes, he joins us from Sydney and has recently returned from Greece. Nick has worked closely, as we've heard, with his collaborator, Antonis Liakos, perhaps Greece's most revered historical analysis of the country's modern history. And it is the book's co-authorship that I think gives the volume a special flavour that permits it to kind of immediately sit as a kind of canonical contribution to the history of Greeks. Not Greece. Greeks. Like me, like many of us in this room, Nick is a child of the diaspora. And as we've heard, his family stems from Kos, and he has, via hard work and commitment to the historical craft, managed from Australian shores to become a world-leading expert in Greek history, as well as histories of the wider Mediterranean world. And this is something I think quite significant to kind of acknowledge. This position of his experience, his life experience maybe, permits him a novel kind of insider-outsider view that has a lot to offer approaches to the study of Greeks, but also the making of history that is not necessarily constrained by its relationship to upholding a kind of fixed view of the nation and its people. Antonis, in a different vein, has interpreted Greek history as perhaps an insider. And he's practiced the study of comparative history and historiography for much of his career. His work, for example, has considered the making of Italy and Greece in a single narrative, and he has, as a historiographer, carefully considered how history is made in tandem with the political dynamics of the present. If one dives into the pages of edited collections and publications on the history of nations, one of which I have here, called Histories of Nations, How Their Identities Were Forged, chapters on Greece are often written by Antonis. So we've got two authoritative historians who've skillfully utilised their historical skill set And what I find most useful in this reinterpretation, however, is that it sits at the intersection of Greek history and what we call in the historical profession global history. Nick and Antonis have approached the study of Greeks by rightly linking it to wider global processes and phenomena. That's uplifting, and by extension stimulating, to see this broader approach form. Nick and Antonis' book not only refreshes well-trodden themes and topic, but also offers little-known insights that speak to broader flows in the Mediterranean region, as well as further afield in Greece's global diasporas, but also how ideas of Greece manifested across borders. A section, for example, on international film and tourism broadens how we might think about how Greece has become a destination in global tourism. I must admit, however, that as I read it, I increasingly became troubled. I'm still not sure if that's the right word, but I was troubled by the mere fact that violence repeatedly marks the lives of Greek people. Reading page after page of many years of brutal conflict, rioting, looting, warring, polarization, and hyper-partisanship, it would be easy to view Greek history as defined by the knife, the gun, the dissenter. This violence permeates the structure of the volume, with chapters like the long First World War. Greece's First World War doesn't begin in 1915 and end in 1918. It starts earlier and it finishes later. The occupation, the civil war, the more recent the crisis years. And this last title closes the volume and brings it right up to our familiar present. The volume, however, aims to do something that has not been done before. It aims to deal with a fulsome notion of Greeks, and therefore includes minorities like Jews, Slav, Macedonians, Pomaks, but also Cypriots and Greeks who have formed communities like ourselves in Egypt, West Germany, Kazakhstan. Chapters 3 and 8, for example, are receptively called The Wider Greek World 1, The End of the Age of Empire, and The Wider Greek World 2, the end, from nationalism to multiculturalism. These chapters signify an important shift in the telling of Greek people's past. They signify that the story of Greece is not confined to a territory or polity. They signify that the story of Greece is, instead of being bound to high politics, or what we call as historians top-down histories, we're presented with a story that gives overdue attention to stories associated with, the diaspora in Cyprus, but also migrations into Greece and the country's evolving relations with the EU and global geopolitical processes. Underlying Nick and Antonis' neat tapestry is a pinpointed claim that, and I'm quoting them here, history is an open-ended narrative. They correctly note that it's, quote, not the role of the historian to propose an optimistic or pessimistic national narrative. Instead, they aim to give meaning to the multiple ways Greeks, including minorities in Greece and Greeks abroad, have navigated the kind of dramatically changing circumstances that presented themselves in the modern era. By delicately touching on familiar and less familiar themes, we learn of Greek people's polarities. We learn of the diversity of Greek politics and culture, and we can begin to see the diversity of this diversity in relation to wider historical processes like global human migration, Cold War politics, competing imperialisms, supranational forces, EU, NATO, multinational economic processes. The story Nick and Antonis eloquently tell us are infused with the inclusive potential that global historical analysis affords. They pause and they take time to make sense of how specific peoples or places are attached to wider forces. And in doing so, a new picture evolves. In this regard, the volume accounts for what has often been overlooked. As the authors write, again I'm quoting, By reading the stories of Greeks within the context of global change and international relations, the book seeks to avoid the trap of exceptionalism, which tend to ascribe too much explanatory power to the Greek character and to the classical and Ottoman historical heritages. I mean, there are so many Greek history books in which I have opened that arc to this type of misguided sense of exceptional Greek character. This book doesn't do that. It attests to the importance of translating academic research for wider audiences as a result. And therefore, I think it's rather digestible, not just to a trained historian like me. We're given the opportunity to take stock of the kind of ebbs and the flows, the modes and nodes of change and exchange that make up the global Greek experience. Permit me a little indulgence here, but Nick and I found ourselves jet-lagged on a panel last year at a symposium in Toronto. And at the Symposium of Modern Greek Studies, we were kind of part of a little Australian contingent with George Kouvados, who spoke here earlier in the year. And we were kind of viewed with a kind of sense of purpose and credibility and authority. There was, from what my Canadian and American colleagues shared, a kind of collective feeling around Nick's presence. Nick, writing from Sydney streets, has been leading the retelling of Greek history. His award-winning volume, Myth and Memory in the Mediterranean, is regarded as an exceptional work of history by scholars around the world. At another iteration of this conference 2 years earlier that I also attended, Antonis Liakos gave the keynote address, and I remember it well for it was delivered via Zoom. Antonis, due to the Trump ban, was not permitted to enter the US as he had visited Iran. Antonis' sole author book, The Greek 20th Century, had just been published, and as he rightly notes in this book, British historiographical production of Greece, not least because of the hegemonic position of English, has determined the country's image all over the world for both Greeks and non-Greeks. So I mention this for is it of great significance that these two minds have come together to join forces to tell this history. They delve into an unusual mix of political, economic, social and cultural history, amplifying their historical expertise, and in doing so permit us to give us a new take on Greeks. Tying Greek experiences to global dynamics, we can consider this volume as a milestone in the writing of our history. A milestone as it takes a large step towards a new horizon. A horizon where inclusivity takes centre stage over exclusivity. A horizon where self-reflection, critical self-reflection, if you will, takes precedence over a triumphal narrative. A horizon where those at the bottom, at the everyday level, are given as much attention to the top men of power. Generals and prime ministers feature, but so do working class labourers, feminist voices, minoritised communities, and street artists. And so, it's with great pleasure that I congratulate Nick and Antonis on their collaborative endeavour. I hope they're proud of their achievement, just as much as I'm delighted to see such work redirect our gaze. Gives me great honour to officially launch from Australian shores the Edinburgh History of Greeks, 20th and early 21st centuries global perspectives. In the words of the authors themselves, quote, historians should keep an open research agenda, allowing the possibility for new questions and the rereading of history in light of new problems, national and global, and newly emerging interests and sensitivities in Greek society and throughout the Greek world. That is, as they write, and I can attest after reading the book, what they have tried to do. Congratulations, Nick, Antonis, and to Tom for a good series, which is a force for good. Thank you.
Thank you, Andoni. And the man of the moment, our author, Nick Doumanis. I invite you to the podium. So.
Wow, that was a wonderful introduction, and I'm thrilled to be here in Melbourne, where I've been allowed to speak several times, usually at Nick Dallas's invitation. He's been a good friend over the years, and both of you, Nick and Antonis, very humbling to hear your words. A bit embarrassing in some ways. Look, I'll just talk a little bit about the book and add to what Antonis said. Like both Nick and Antonis said, there are several books in English on modern Greek history. The best known is Richard Clogg's Concise History, which has many virtues. It is well written, it's careful, it's by a serious academic historian, now in its 4th edition, and it's authoritative. It's very good. There's another one, Roderick Beaton, Greece, Biography of a Nation. I wrote a very critical review of it, but it's well written and it is reliable. There is Christopher Woodhouse's History, an older book you may remember. A man who has lived Greek history himself as an outsider and was there during the war and in other capacities. Which is also very good in its own way. So there's a number of good Greek history books to choose from. And then there's Tom Gallant, my series editor, who's written a general history of modern Greece, which you can get by Bloomsbury, and it's about to come out in its 3rd edition. John Koliopoulos, Veremis, you may know these names. I mean, I'm not going to put down my competition. They do good work. And in fact, one of the best is an Englishman based in Australia who's retired, who's been very quiet. His name is David Close. And he wrote 2 fantastic books, The Origins of the Greek Civil War and Greece Since 1945, which together are like an excellent world standard coverage of Greece between, say, 1930 and 1980. So plenty of good books in English. So why did we bother? You know, why would we do that? Go to this kind of trouble? And of course, there's lots more books in Greek. People like Datilis, Hatziossif, Kostis, Liakos has his own book. They're written differently. They're written for Greek audiences, so they write it in a different way, and they can be very polemical and very partisan if they want to. But you know, when they write, they often take things for granted, like Greeks who've been to school will know certain things, whereas with an English-speaking audience around the world, you have to introduce, you know, what does dichasmos mean? What does the metapolitevsi mean? You've got to spell these things out. But what's different about our book? Well, before I answer that, a quick story of how that book came together, how we did it. Back in mid-2000s, I was approached by Thomas Gallant, who had just organised with the University of Edinburgh Press a series on the history of the Greeks, which goes right back to antiquity, right back. And he asked me to do the 20th century volume. He was doing the 19th century, Molly Green did the early modern period. Those books came out eventually. I was silly and youthful and said yes. But then I had to ask myself after saying yes, what's my line? Why would I write a history that competes with Clogg and Woodhouse? And I didn't have a serious answer. You just can't write a history. You've got to have an idea of what it should look like that's different from what is already out there. Otherwise, why put your people through buying it and reading it? At the time, I'd written on the Italians and the Dodecanese. I'd just finished a book on the history of Italy. I was working on a book on the Greeks in Asia Minor, where I studied coexistence, how Muslims and Christians coexisted before the Troubles started. I'd never worked on Greece at all, Greece proper. I'd never taken a course in Greek history. I had a left-wing reading of it, but not particularly original. after a few years working on other things, because often what we do as historians is we get invitations, we say yes, and then we sit on those invitations for years, and our publishers get very cranky. I waited to find out, well, maybe a line will come to me, but it never did. It didn't initially. And I tried to palm it off, tried to give it away. Then I came up with this brilliant idea. I'd met Antonis Liakos in 1996 at a conference. He's already a major historian of Greece. I won't describe him because you've already kind of shown how he is a very, very significant, I would say he's probably Greece's leading historian, but that's arguable, but he's certainly extremely well known internationally. He's even mentioned in major books like Imagined Communities by Benedict Anderson. But the important thing for me is that he and I have the same kinds of interests: historiography, how history is written, why it's written, what's the purpose of history. We're interested in this sort of stuff together, and we kind of tended to agree on everything, which is a good thing if you're going to work with somebody. And it's also, he's also, like Nick said, he's interested in national identity as something you've got to approach critically. It's real, but it's historically created. It doesn't come out of nowhere. And we've always had a shared interest. And we've also had a shared interest in global developments as well and how they impact on Greece. So, both of us kind of have always wondered why Greece is where it is, why it's in that kind of situation. Global developments are very important. Greece and Portugal are pretty similar in size and number, but they're very, very different histories. A lot of it's got to do with geography. Portugal's perched on the Atlantic, Greece is perched next to Turkey and next to Russia. Those two facts alone say a lot about why they've got these different historical trajectories, and yet they've got they've got a lot in common. They both had dictatorships. They both, along with Spain, the dictatorships fell almost at the same time. All three countries then made a beeline for Europe and wanted to join the EU. These things, they're not coincidences, and we grappled with these things. And I think it has an important bearing on the story. Anyway, so we agreed to join forces. I actually wanted to give it to him, but he said, let's do it together. I said, oh, okay. And then he said to me, because he's very senior, he said, you do Cyprus and the diaspora, I'll do the other stuff, and then we'll work it out. So, okay. So it's going to be 70-30. Him 70, me 30. I thought, that's good. I'll do less work. But then we kept on having to finish our own other works, and then he got free early, and he started to write his chapters. This is around 2018. And I started getting these chapters arriving, and I still had this other work I was finishing up, but I kept on reading his stuff in Greek. Oh, well, this is really good. And then he went ahead and published it in Greek. I thought, oh my God, how is this going to work now? This is weird. Anyway, then I thought, why don't I reread it and rewrite them and see what he does? And this is actually what I hear a lot of singers, musicians like when they write songs, they like to hear how it's reinterpreted by others. And luckily, Antonis liked what I did with his work and how I added things. And I added theories into it which would be known outside, not particularly well known in Greece. He liked the way I reworked his work. And there's a lot different. Actually, it's not the same book now. It changed because what happened was he kept on giving me chapters. I kept on rewriting his chapters. And then I wrote my chapters, and he took my chapters and he started kind of scribbling through it. And then I wrote an introduction because he didn't have an introduction. He thought everyone knows what happened in 1912. I said, no, nobody outside of Greece, they don't know what was going on, what the Greece was like in September 1912, and how different it was a year later. it doubled in size, and everything changed. But I had to explain what it was like before. So it's this thing that we kept on giving each other our work. You can do that with the wonders of modern technology. He was either in Athens, in Exarchia, or in his retreat in Andros, and I was in my kitchen in Sydney because there was a lockdown as well. So we kept on giving each other our chapters, and we kept reworking and working them and going over and over. And I noticed he stopped in 2008, 2010. And I thought, you know what? I think people are not going to be happy when the book, they read so much and then it stops in 2010, it's now 2020. And a lot has happened since then. And the other thing is, we wanted to show, Greece was in the midst of a crisis when we were talking. We wanted to use history to explain Greece, why it was in that situation. So we can't stop in 2010. And normally when you have these partnerships, they're awful. Even when you're related, they tend to be, you never hear good stories from writing partnerships. Ours was a dream. As soon as I said, let's write another chapter, he said, yeah, you're right. Like, it was like Lennon and McCartney. We're not that good. We're not that good. But, you know, it was like, we kind of worked together well, and maybe it was good that we never met. I went to Greece, I still didn't see him, because he was in, we mixed it up. He went to Andros and I couldn't see him. Anyway, it worked well. And eventually, so when it came to the last chapter, that was the most difficult, because Greece, it was a few years after the referendum, a very fraught year, 2015. We had to explain it. That was hard. I mean, how do you explain Greece goes to the polls, gets 60%, rejects the EU, the proposal, and then a week later Syriza says yes to the, you know, how do you explain that? Why did they go to the trouble? Well, I think we've given an interesting answer. It's one of the few times when we had to explain the Greek, what's going on in the Greek mind here. And also, I had to get out of my comfort zone. I had to do financial history. Like, I can't even do my own finances. But understanding the complexities of the financial crisis, and then how it was dealt with, and what the EU was going on about, the toing and froing, that was a really interesting exercise, because I would write my bits about the referendum and the economics, and Antonis would read it, and then take him to actual finance ministers, Greek finance ministers of the past, both of Nea Demokratia, both of the right and the left, PASOK. We didn't give it to Yanis Varoufakis because I know him and I know what he'll say. But we showed it to most of the ex-finance ministers, none of whom liked what we wrote, but none of them who hated it either, which is a good result. They all kind of had a few things to say. And also Antonis, who was kind of, his wife, his late partner, was a minister in the Syriza minister. Kind of was close to what happened in those heady days. And so my narrative had to be changed because of what they knew. Anyway, we got something going and it makes sense. The other thing that was interesting about that last chapter is that it's hard to write contemporary history. Like, you can't, it's very hard to know what the significance is of the present. Because you need, as historians, we have the benefit of time where now we can see patterns, but when you're on the mountain, you can't see the mountain. So our last chapter is kind of like an initial step towards how to write the history of the last 10 years. So we focused on the financial crisis. We focused on the human misery that it cost, because that's another thing. You know, as the other guys have said tonight, we're mainly interested in Greek society and people rather than the big people who inflict the pain. And the human costs of this crisis were, I mean, we're not talking about death, but we're talking about impoverishment, It's quite serious. So we talked about that, but we also talked about immigration because Greece became the front line of a massive refugee wave, which had serious consequences. Also the rise of far-right politics, mainly the Golden Dawn, and needed to explain that. And also the other theme that we did focus on was on, now I'm drawing a blank, Turkey, Greece and Turkey, and the issues over oil, which are still with us. And we just touched on COVID. We just got a bit in there. So we tried to get it to the present. It's very hard to do that. It's hard to know when to stop. And we also didn't say that the crisis was over. Although if you go to Greece now, it looks like it's pretty much back in business. But you know, we need time. Time will tell whether it is or not. I think also what we do really well, and this is mainly Antonis, is to make sense of the last 30 years leading up to the crisis, because we think history kind of stops around 1981. You've had the fall of the junta, and then the country is normalised. A two-party political system. Democracy is re-established firmly. It becomes what we call hegemonic. What everyone seems to be, everyone accepts as normal, whereas that was the problem before that. There was a lot of people in Greece who thought dictatorship was the way Greece should be ruled. That spell was broken in 1974. So 1981, with the PASOK coming into power, after that the narrative starts to look boring. The violence disappears, and it becomes more of the usual kind of thing, except that what happened in 2008, 2010 is the product of what happened after 1981. Like something went wrong as well. Something went well, something went wrong. So we look at those things, how Greece did actually flourish, and Greece in the 1990s is a great place. People I know from here, we're starting to migrate back. But also the seeds of the troubles of the late 2000s were sown. And both political parties, but I have to say mainly PASOK, who was in power most of the time. It's interesting, PASOK was the natural party of government, like the Libs are here. They were normally in. But something went wrong. Both sides mismanaged it. Anyway, that period of history is interesting because it's hard to turn it into something interesting and dramatic. But I think we manage it. And finally, I'd like to talk. I'll just say a few words about the Greeks, because we do talk about Greece. Greece is the focus of the book. It can't not be, because from 1912 onwards, most Greeks in the world, for the first time ever, live within a Greek polity. Maybe, or since Byzantium, right? A Greek polity. So that's important. And most Greeks, their lives was affected by the kind of governments they had, because the governments all around the world had a greater say in how people lived. They had the power to change people's lives. Whereas before 1912, government, the state was something that was far away. Don't think that when the Greeks were under Ottoman rule, they saw Ottomans everywhere. They hardly ever saw them. The islands where I came from, they never saw them, right? It's in the 20th century where government becomes this big thing which it affects lives, where you have even fascism was about creating fascist man. Like they were coming into the bedroom telling people how many children you should have and killing people because they didn't fit into a national kind of ideal. So the 20th century, you can't avoid the nation. You've got to look at the nation. But Greeks also lived in other nations. They lived in Cyprus. One of the great joys of doing this book is that I was compelled to learn the history of Cyprus. And I enjoyed it. And enough to know that there's not a very there is hardly any well-written book about the history of Cyprus. Okay, that's what it needs somebody. Hint, hint. You know, we do need some much better work on Cyprus, and it's got an interesting history, and it's different. It's not like you can't write, you know, you can't put them in the same narrative as the history of people in Greece, because their experiences were different. They go to a different timeline, you know, and their experiences of the crisis was different, the economic crisis. It was a different kind of crisis that they had, and that's why they got out of it very, very quickly. So that was very, very interesting, but also the diaspora. How do you kind of tie that in with the rest? One of the things that's always bugged me, and possibly bugged you, that those of us who leave Greece, our parents, who once they leave Greece, they're not important when it comes historically. They become part of this thing called the diaspora. Bye-bye. They're important because they send money home, but otherwise they don't figure. In fact, what's really interesting is that the diaspora changes dramatically in the 20th century, from one which is kind of dispersed, many merchants dispersed around Europe and major cities and some colonial empires. In the 20th century, it becomes more of a worker thing, mid-20th century, a working class that focuses in the most advanced economies of the world, the United States, West Germany, Australia, and what these people do is that they want to remain Greek, so they've got all conform to the same model. They all build a kinotita. They all build a church. Then they fight over those things. But, you know, they all do the same things, but they're forceful, dramatic, and they clash. But those patterns are interesting too. And they're part of a broader Greek experience. You know, it's hard to put them in the same story with the Greeks at home, because they had a different... Αυτοί ζήσανε την Ελλάδα, we lived with Australia, and it's a different kind of life. But there's a lot that still ties us together. And what we try to do in the book is to bring that all together in a way that you can that is digestible, that you can read it and see how it all hangs together. So I thank everybody for having me. I suppose there's questions. Nick, we're going to... Yeah, so I'll just stop there and let Nick take charge.
I'll position myself correctly. Thank you, Nico. I think I might kickstart the questioning. Part of this work was Antonis Liakos' initial book in Greek, and you've said that working together and sending the articles and chapters back and forth has become a totally different book. So any possibility of translating this back into Greek? And
yeah, no, it is on the cards, because the series editor, Thomas Gallant, wants to publish the three... there's 4 books in a series. He didn't manage to get any ancient ones done. But there's a medieval one covering the period 500 to 1000. But then there's the early modern one, the one that's the Turkokratia, the Turkish period, the Ottoman period. And then his one, the 19th century, and our one, the 20th century. And together, they're going to be translated together and sold as a package in Greek. So they will come back out in Greek, and ours would have to be retranslated because they can't just get chunks from his old book.
No, it's such a different book. Yeah. Okay. Oh, an excellent effort. Okay.
Thanks, Nick. That was great. And it sounds like a really juicy read. Just 2 really quick questions, if I could. One, do you have a forward terminal date for it? Did you sort of come up with, does it cut out at 2016 or 2018 or 2020?
Yeah, we cut out, really, we handed the manuscript in last year.
Yeah.
And we slip in a few things of what happened in 2022.
Right.
But 2021, we talk about COVID and how, because of Greece's experiences in dealing with the crisis, it seemed, at least in the initial stages, to handle the public call for appropriate public behaviour for the COVID crisis. It seemed that Greece slipped in reasonably well, comparatively. But then we left it at that. We didn't go on and on because we were still in the middle of all that stuff, and it could have gone pear-shaped whilst we were writing. Right. Once we put it in. So, but we were careful. But we do get a bit of COVID in. Yeah. And that was important because, obviously because it was a collective national approach.
Yeah. So it's super contemporary then in that respect.
As much as we could, as much as we could. I mean, now it's been a year. Yeah.
And the second question, really quickly, if I may, I caught wind of a really interesting chapter that's in the book that you don't normally come across. I believe that it was titled The Booming Film Industry, or the Film Industry and Cultural Tourism. Could you tell us just a little bit about that?
Yeah, I wish we could have written a lot more. But until the 1950s, you'd go to Greece you'd go to Greece if you're upper middle class because of the classical inheritance, to see Greece, the Greece of your imagination after reading the classics. But in the 50s, what we call tourism is starting to become more mass. Like there's more of a general movement, and then there's this idea that sitting in the sun is therapeutic, and going to the beach is good for you. And then there's this lifestyle thing, and the movies, the Hollywood movies were starting to promote this by the late 50s. And interestingly, 3 important movies come out around that time: Boy and a Dolphin, Never on a Sunday. What's the other one? Zorba the Greek, which I don't know if that's an advertisement for Greece, if you've ever seen it. But still, but certainly Greece is starting to look like a place where you can have pleasure. And so it wasn't always thus, but then, so Greece becomes a brand, and they do sell. Greece becomes a kind of a brand that's for the blue rinse set, for the yacht. Anastas and his lifestyle starts to play a role in this. So Greece starts to look like a place to kind of have a holiday. And until that point, I think only Rhodes and Corfu really catered to tourism. But it starts to, and then obviously there are problems in kind of starting a tourism industry quickly. You get the wrong people start to do it. You remember those early trips to Greece. I don't know how poor the services were. You'd go into a shop, like that, or that surly. If you go now, I'm sure you'll agree, it's different. Okay, so it takes a while for that, but it started. The tourist industry starts. And so we were interested in how that shift in Greece happens. But we don't get enough chance to talk too much about it because we've got other things to talk about.
There must be some more questions from Nick. Liakos?
Towards the end, Nick, you touched upon how the Greeks perceive the diaspora. And if I'm not mistaken, you said they really, once we've gone, we've forgotten. And that's the truth. Now, all of a sudden, I mean, this is probably, I want you to make a more general comment. It looks like the Greeks have rediscovered us and they want us to vote in the next election. Do you have a view on that, considering that you've written about the history of Greeks and you've written on how they perceive the diaspora? How do you see their sudden interest and love affair with us?
I don't have well-developed thoughts on that, except that I think if you're going to be allowed to vote, you've got to have a stake in the place. You pay taxes there. I don't think I should, because I don't have anything. I don't have property. I don't have to pay taxes there. I've never sought it. How do I explain that interest? Maybe they've realised that it's worth cultivating those links. They've often done that, but if they've waxed and waned. Right.
Just like back in the 50s and 60s, they said, and many of us that went back, they used to say, look, it's great to come back here, we come back for a holiday, let us run our show by ourselves. So I'm not too sure whether or not the interest that the government has shown reflects the reality of Greek citizens anyway. So I think I'll be very interested to read the book. I must admit, I haven't read it, but I will read it, and I'll be interested to see how you basically interpret their perception of us.
Yeah, I don't look. What I've been interested in I write a lot about. We write a lot about the diaspora, but and it has always played a role in Greek history, right? Going back to antiquity, ancient. I was just in Sicily, for example, and a place called Naxos. You know, and those places maintained relations back home. There's always been relations, and we've had relations now, but they're fraught. But it's true, and particularly in the 20th century, when you leave, they forget you, and when you go back, you annoy them, because, well, I actually asked them back 30 years ago, and they said, look, especially the Americans, Greek Americans, when they come back here, they criticise everything, you know, and that annoys them, and it's. There's a whole thesis that can be written about that relationship. There's a lot to it, and I think at heart, it's the fact that if you live in Greece, you have a different kind of life, and then you go to West Germany or Australia and America, you'd live a very, very different life, and then you come back and see your old siblings, and you're different people. And there's always going to be something and the kleronomias, the issue of inheritances, which is the bane, is terrible issue. We're never going to get over that. But that's all, you know, why, you know, the common complaint at home is, why do they want their properties back here? They're rich in Australia. You know, that kind of stuff is now, as for the official line, that waxes and wanes, and I agree, it tends to be superficial.
And Greece is a very late comer to this as well, Nick, because there have been other countries who have allowed the diaspora vote for quite a while. Malta, Italy, Turkey, North Macedonia.
I don't have a developed view on that idea.
Just one moment, Maria.
Yeah, I did. I actually like to say, from a personal experience being in Greece recently, my cousin, a female cousin, actually said, I don't believe you should have a vote or any right to vote since you left. And she made it so clear that she was so against the government for even thinking of giving us any rights. I guess my personal view is, she said, but you don't know my life. But then you also mentioned, Nicholas, that we have a different view. And we do read, we are informed. Her position was that we're not informed, and yet I feel that we were very informed while we are away, and we can make a judgment, or, you know, with a lot of intent for the goodwill, but they can't see that. Like you said, we're absent. Yeah.
Thank you, Maria. I'll take that more as a comment. Maria?
Nick, your first history book was written, published when? 2000 and...
My first one, 1997, last century.
Okay. Yeah, the one that was launched here too. And I'm thinking, over the years as you've been studying Greek history, has there been a really new learning for you, something that's really impressed you, something that you might have changed from your earlier writings?
New? Yeah, I mean, it continues to evolve. You change all the time. I've been trying to actually get away from Greeks, but I can't seem to be able to do it. I'm trying to, I mean, this book I'm writing on the Eastern Mediterranean doesn't actually have as many Greeks in it as you might think. But when I'm dragged back in, like Antonis in a way dragged me back in, he got me more interested in it, in the Greek experience, and I learned new things. all the time. It's one of the reasons why I've never regretted becoming an historian. You can't lose interest in it. You know, there's always something to learn that's interesting. It can be depressing. I mean, writing the history of Cyprus, for example, gets really depressing because it becomes this unsolvable problem where a minority leverages its power so effectively against a majority. I mean, this is not an anti-Turkish thing, but you know, it's one of the few places in the world where a minority is in charge of the process, you know, and it leverages itself very effectively. But then looking at how Cyprus after 74 prospers enormously, and I'm thinking that's a great. I didn't realise how much Cyprus bounced back and how clever that country's been. And then the problem it got into in the crisis, but then how it got out of it. So these things I didn't know, and so you learn. These are the new things that you learn. You think, oh, maybe it's good that I've stuck to the Greek history stuff. And the diaspora is an uncharted area. I mean, it's inadequately studied, partly because Greeks in Greece think, if you're going to do the history of Greece, it's Greece you're really doing. Well, I'm trying to say no. It's always been something a lot larger.
That's going to be the next question. Did you struggle writing about the diaspora, because it's not vanilla flavoured? There are many diasporas and very different. The Gastarbeiter experience in Germany is very different to the Australian experience, or the Greeks in Africa who are like an influential class. Or
it's hard to kind of fit it into an ongoing narrative. But then you stand back and you realise there are some patterns. So if you look at the Greeks outside of Greece in 1912, they're all the bulk of them are in Anatolia and Constantinople, Thrace. But there's I was surprised about how many Greeks there were in the Russian Empire. A lot of Greeks in the Russian Empire, mainly from Pontus. But they're also still a diverse group, and then in Egypt, and they're all different in their own way. But that's the centre of the Greek world, outside, right? And by the middle of the century, those three populations are either scattered or destroyed. So that concentration disappears. So the Greeks are kicked out of Egypt. They're kicked out of obviously Anatolia back in 1922. But they're also what remains of the Greeks in Constantinople, Istanbul, leave by 1963, right? So that world is gone, and the Russians have kind of dispersed to
Central Asia.
but then they come back. A lot of them come back to Greece, or come back. They don't come back to Greece. They've never been there. But then the importance of the American and the Australian, but then the West German, most Greeks who left Greece after World War II went to West Germany. They didn't go to America or Australia. We forget that. Tons of them, you know, and mainly from the north of Greece, where those people didn't have the links in America, like the Peloponnesians go to America because they've got these family links. Or, you know, we've got people from Kythera, Ithaca, whatever, they've got these links here. But you know, so there's interesting patterns. What you do as an historian is you try to find some of the principal patterns. Now, you'll then say, well, there was Greeks in South Africa, there was Greeks in Senegal, there are Greeks everywhere. The only places you won't find them are in East Asia, where the Chinese beat us in small business, right? But even then, Doumanis has written a book on East Asia, I bet. You know, so he's probably found Greeks there as well. But even they conform to some kind of pattern too. There's always these lonely Greek shops you'll find in Iran, or not now, but used to find in Iran. A Greek would have open up a bakalik or somewhere, or in any part of Africa. I'm told by Ethiopians that they remember going, nostalgically, they remember going to the Greek confectioners, because the Greeks were the confectioners in Addis Ababa. So there's certain things that Greeks tend to do, and they copy each other. Come here, they work in Uncle so-and-so's fish and chip shop or cafe. They go down to the next town, do the same thing, and those patterns kind of you find similar things happening in America. So there is a story there. I've got the skeleton of it here in this book. I'm going to write a bigger book next on that whole thing. That's my plan.
Just by way of a comment, really, or a few comments, I'm really looking forward to reading it. I love it before the nation. I thought it was such a opened, a lot of windows to the experience of Greeks in Asia Minor under the Ottoman Empire, not what was the normal sort of national narrative, I suppose. And that's, to me, is I'm really interested in that. You're saying how someone of Scottish heritage or born there, the whole invention of national identity, and people sort of look and think, say Greek or Scottish or English or whatever, national identity is so fixed, but you know that it's not. It's created at a particular time, added to, it's malleable, serving, national political purposes. So I find that really sort of interesting. I'm looking forward to reading that. But I just think that's sort of what the other thing the comment is made about, going back to Greece, the diaspora versus, your homeland, whatever you want to call it. But it's sort of like, I think in a way, the past is always another country. So people think, usually with migration, when my parents went back to Scotland, they eventually didn't really like it because it wasn't the 60s or what they remembered. But I think even now, when we come to Australia, brought up in Paran, it's totally different now. It's not the Paran that I used to. So I think sort of this whole thing about identification with something in the past and you want it fixed is it's a big mistake. It's because you can't go back.
Look, I'm glad you said that. It reminded me of a bit that I wrote that got cut out. It remained on the editorial floor. I started the big book, by looking at women and thinking, okay, I remember my great-grandmother. She wore a headscarf. She was humble. She kind of had a role. She wasn't allowed to move around freely, and her kind of lifestyle, backbreaking hard work, was exactly the same as her mother and her mother and her mother and her mother, going back centuries. But in the 20th century, she was the last. Her daughter had a completely different experience. She dropped the headscarf. She worked differently, still restricted, still patriarchal, became a migrant, started working in a factory, had it more to say in the what happens in the family, and then the next generation, the girls can go nearly anywhere where they like. They're going to uni. See what I mean? In the 20th century, life changes it's almost normal for everything to change, whereas before 1914, the 20th century, nothing changed, very little changed. Change became normal in the 20th century, and it's still changing, right? And looking at the lives of women, I wish we wrote more about women's experiences. You'll see that the 20th century, everything changes and it keeps changing, and it's still changing. And that captures the recent history better than anything.
Isn't there saying, I think by the early 20th century, I think 95% of people lived and died within 20 kilometres of the area they were born, so equally with men as well. You didn't have that level of mobility.
Yeah. One thing, though, that is really interesting about the Greeks is, compared to other people, you're right, but compared to other people, they seem to be particularly more mobile. Compared to Bulgarians or to Turks or to others, Greeks are extremely mobile. But
there's voluntary and involuntary mobility as well.
But let's talk about just the voluntary. A typical person from Naxos couldn't work all year in his village at home. So half the year he was in Smyrni working in something, or working on a construction site in Aydin or in Athens, or some would go for several years to America, become a Bruklidi. You know, work in a factory, come back with the prika, you know, set up the sisters. But there's something about the geography of Greece. No part of Greece is too far away from a port. Also, Greece is a pile of rocks. It's hard for people to have just live off the land. So they have to be diverse, versatile. That's why, and this is my theory, that's why whenever Greeks go overseas, they quickly move into small business, or they do certain things. They figure out what else they can do to supplement the income of the farm back home. They're not just farmers, they have to be versatile, and it's because of the geography. You know, the geography will create the mentality, not the other way around.
But the reverse can also happen. Like, for example, if you're from Grevena, even in the 1950s and 60s, unless you did your military conscription, you might not have seen the ocean or something like that. So, anyway. Any further?
Antonis Liakos, a very controversial figure in Greece. A lot of people love him, and there's a few people that dislike him. You mentioned that you found working with him very easy, very productively. What do you have to say about why that perception of Antonis Liakos exists in Greece?
Because he's a proper public intellectual. He intervenes. He goes into the newspapers and he has something to say about education, say, or race, or refugees, and you'll be a lightning rod. So he's brave, but he has an opinion and he puts it forcefully, and you'll attract criticism. He is generally of this kind of left of centre critique of conservative views about national identity, for example. He's big on that. The book, we don't go on much about it, national identity, because we've done it before, and there's a lot more to talk about. Greece is not just about identity. I don't think history is just about identity. It's about the way you live. It's about class. It's about, you know. Anyway, so, but going back to your question, yeah, it's because he's a true public intellectual, and Greece is a place. At least there's a robust public debate on stuff. Here, it's not the same.
Can I just yell one out, if that's all right? Just back onto the diaspora versus the motherland or the home country. There's a sense, and I had it sort of, I'm half Italian, half Greek, and I get it from sort of both cultures, but on the Greek side, you tend to be sort of ossified or fossilised over here with a viewpoint of what's really going on in the motherland, or the values that our grandparents brought over here and our parents adopted or accepted became very fixed. And when they go back for their first trip or a series of trips, it kind of blows their mind how much that country has changed and how far behind they are the 8 ball. And they stick out like proverbial because of it. They don't really get it.
How does that compare to the Italian experience? That's interesting. That'll be interesting.
A little bit less rigid in a sense like that, because there's so many more of them.
You haven't seen any Giavati clips. That's why you say that's.
All I'm saying is that Greece being a smaller community, when you go back to it, it seems more fixed in the mind and more fixed in values with say, my Greek mother. Whereas the Italian side, it's more. The community is much larger here as well. It's much larger over there, and so there's a bit more sort of quicksilver on the Italian front.
Can I say that just from studying both countries for decades, I find that in Greece the nationalism has been successful in the sense of creating a real sense of a unified group. It's hard nowadays to go to Greece and find another accent anymore. Everyone speaks BBC Greek, you know. Italy is a place where nationalism had extraordinary difficulty in creating a kind of a very hard identity. Greece managed to do that, and there's pros and cons to that. I mean, with Italy, there's at least the diversity of the country is intact. Whereas in Greece, I think a lot of that diverse flavour is gone. And I always like it when I hear a thick Cypriot accent, because it reminds me that there was a time when Greeks spoke different dialects. And I wonder, actually, when the Greeks first came to Australia from different parts of Greece, how that kind of worked out. You know, how did those differences? I think it seems to be overridden in the literature. I don't see it. So Italians don't go out around the world with a hard identity. At the same time, they've got a more established international brand, right? Frank Sinatra, pizza, pasta, happy-go-lucky, mafia. Okay, Greece has to work harder to get noticed. You know, it's like, look at us, and we get, you know, considering how small Greece is, its profile is really big compared to, say, Romania's double the size of Greece. Who knows anything about the Romanians? The Bulgarians, nothing. The Turks really probably get the shits when Greece gets so much attention, and they get hardly any. So Greece has actually done extraordinary things in promoting its profile, but in the diaspora, I've looked at the diasporas, and the Greeks have a particular desire to remain Greek. So the biggest indication of that is associations. The Greeks were exceptional when it came to building associations. There's associations for everything. I mean, they're all dying now, and I'm glad this is kind of, you know, I think this is an antidote to all that impetus. But when the Greeks first came to Australia, all the regional fraternities sprouted. You know, we had 2 Pontian communities in Sydney. I mean, for political reasons.
That's pretty good.
They were fighting, but they were left and right. But, you know, we had soccer clubs. We had this, and they keep on wanting to get together. Why? Because they want to stick together and retain something, that Greek thing, and the only thing they put their hands in their pockets for is for Greek language classes. Not my oral history project, but Greek, you know. So that's, whereas in Italians don't feel that it's not as strong, and Italian is easier to sell as a language because it's rather easier to learn anyway. Anyway, that's I can go on and on about that.
Okay, I encourage you all to buy Nick and Antonis' book. It's definitely sort of worth the read. Big round of applause for our speaker today.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Best of luck in Chicago. Don't get mugged. And so hope to see you again at some point in the future. And best of luck with any future research and writing.
Thank you. I'll be back.